Spring 1944. Deep in the French countryside, smoke curls over fields that once grew wheat. The ground trembles, not with harvest, but with the distant thud of advancing tanks. In the shadow of Nazi occupation, one village braces for annihilation. But in a barn choked with rust and grease, a man is building something no one believes can work. His tools are broken. His parts come from dead tractors and bombed-out cars. But what he's building will soon take on Hitler's war machine and win. He's not a soldier, not a general, just a farm engineer with a fierce mind and fire in his heart. What he creates from junkyard scrap will not only hold the line, it will become legend. This is the untold story of the wild engineer who built a tank from farming scrap and changed history. In the summer of 1940, France fell. The Blitzkrieg rolled through the Ardennes like a hammer through glass, and within weeks, swastikas flew over Paris. But far from the headlines in the agricultural heartlands of Normandy, life twisted into something darker. German convoys rumbled through farmland roads, commandeering fuel, tools, and young men. In the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, a quiet farming town on the coast, survival became a negotiation. Every tractor, every can of oil, every bolt of steel was either taken or taxed by the occupation. For a mechanic like Georges Lecointe, it was the death of a dream. Georges had never seen war before. He had never held a rifle, never worn a uniform. But he knew machines. As a child, he fixed broken plows with twine and bent nails. By the time he was 25, he could dismantle an engine blindfolded and rebuild it with half the parts. In another world, he might have designed cars in Lyon or Berlin. But war doesn't wait for dreams. When the Nazis came, Georges was forced to work on German trucks, repairing them under the watchful eyes of SS officers while they used his barn as a depot. His tools were stolen, his land was patrolled, and worse, his neighbors began to vanish. One by one, the able-bodied men of the region were requisitioned, a polite word for kidnapped and sent to labor camps. Georges stayed, silent but boiling. He knew a resistance meant death. He knew that a misstep meant his mother, his wife, even his young daughter could be shot without trial. But he watched. Every tank that rumbled past, every faulty gear, every soldier's complaint. He listened. He took mental notes. And deep down, a plan began to grow. Not one of sabotage, but of construction. He didn't want to blow up a convoy. He wanted to build something that could stop one. It was madness. France had no tanks left. The Germans had looted what remained. The resistance had guns, courage, and the knowledge of back roads, but no armor, no firepower, no way to stand toe-to-toe. And Georges? He had a busted tractor, a welder, and a barn full of rusted scrap. But what he lacked in resources, he made up for in obsession. He began collecting, quietly. A broken engine block from a shelled car, treads from an abandoned German supply vehicle, steel plating from a collapsed roof. He told the soldiers it was for repairs, spare parts for farming equipment. They laughed. One SS officer even joked that Georges could build his own Panzer one day. Georges just smiled, but he wasn't joking. He studied blueprints at night, stolen from a downed Allied plane, passed through resistance hands, burned into his memory. He modified them, simplified them. He knew he couldn't match German engineering, but he didn't need to. He needed something strong enough to protect three men, fast enough to move through narrow village streets, and powerful enough to punch through a roadblock. And above all, it had to be built in total secrecy. For 6 months, he worked by lantern light. Every hammer strike was muffled. Every weld was done behind a wall of hay bales. The villagers knew something was happening, but said nothing. In Nazi-occupied France, silence was resistance. But Georges wasn't just building a machine. He was building a message. To the Germans, you can't take everything. To the French, we are not finished. And to his daughter, barely 5 years old, he was building a future worth surviving for. Outside, the war raged. The Allies were stalled in Italy. The Eastern Front was a bloodbath. And in northern France, Hitler was fortifying the coast, convinced the invasion would come through Calais. But the Americans had other plans. D-Day was coming, and Georges Lecointe, wild, brilliant, and defiant, was about to drive straight into history. It did not look like a tank, not at first. In the flickering barn light, beneath layers of tarps and straw bales, it looked like a failed experiment. Twisted steel, mismatched wheels, gears half assembled, and the reek of oil and sweat in the air. But Georges Lecointe didn't care how it looked. He cared what it could withstand. Every bolt he tightened, every plate he welded, carried the weight of impossible stakes. He wasn't just building a vehicle, he was building defiance itself. By spring 1944, the machine beneath the hay was no longer a dream. It had shape, mass, and most important of all, movement. The foundation was an old Renault tractor, burned in a Luftwaffe strafing run, abandoned in a ditch near Caen, its engine block intact but nearly everything else destroyed. Georges had salvaged it under the pretense of farming repairs. No one cared about a rusted tractor, but to Georges, it was the heart of a monster. He stripped its gears, reinforced the axles, and installed a modified gearbox from a German supply truck. It ran unevenly, belching smoke and screamed when shifting, like a wounded beast. But it moved. On nights when the sky was loud with bombers, Georges rolled the chassis forward, inch by inch, testing the weight, the balance, the turn radius. He recorded everything in a leather notebook, half in code, half in shorthand. He didn't have schematics. He had instinct. The armor came next. He didn't have access to military-grade steel, but he knew the properties of metal better than most soldiers. He cut boiler plating from destroyed buildings, salvaged iron doors from the ruins of a nearby factory, even melted down the steel fencing. The plates didn't match. Some were curved, others flat. But Georges learned to layer them, overlap the welds, embrace the joints with welded pipe frames. The result was crude but strong, a patchwork shell of jagged armor braced with rivets and desperation. He mounted them on a steel skeleton of his own design, a sort of exoskeleton over the tractor's original body, with sloped angles to deflect small arms fire. It wouldn't hold against a Panzer's 75mm cannon, but it didn't have to. It just needed to survive a firefight long enough to punch through. Inside, space was tighter than a coffin. Georges carved out just enough room for 2 passengers, 1 gunner, 1 loader, and a 3rd compartment for the driver. No radios, no visibility except a narrow slit of glass wrapped in thick rubber and reinforced with a steel visor. The inside stank of fuel, oil, and sweat. There was no insulation. Heat from the engine turned the compartment into a furnace. But to Georges, it felt like sanctuary. He named it La Chimère, the Chimera, a beast born of scrap, flame, and fear. It had no formal designation, no model number, but it had teeth. For weaponry, Georges installed a captured MG-34 machine gun, liberated from a downed German convoy and hidden in a grain silo for over a year. He mounted it through a rotating metal hatch, welded from tractor rims, and bolted into a makeshift turret. It could swivel, barely, but the angle was narrow. He reinforced the gun shield with spare iron plates. Reloading would be hell. Accuracy would be minimal. But at close range, it could tear through a patrol. Still, Georges knew this wasn't a military vehicle. It was a message made of steel. His hope was never to win a war. It was to delay, disrupt, and most importantly, to show that courage could be engineered. Every night he crawled back home aching, covered in soot and grease, his fingers blistered from the torch. His wife patched his shirts and never asked where he went. His daughter, sensing the tension, grew quiet. But Georges couldn't stop. As the days grew longer, the sounds of war drew closer. Artillery echoed from the west. Rumors of Allied landings passed in whispers. The resistance grew restless. One night, a man appeared at Georges' door. Dirty boots, sharp eyes, British accent. He introduced himself only as Harris, a liaison from the Special Operations Executive, embedded with the French Maquis. He had heard rumors, a local mechanic building something armored in a barn. Most thought it was fantasy, but Harris didn't come to mock. He came with a plan. The Allies, he said, were preparing to land. Soon, maybe weeks, maybe days. The Germans had fortified every beach, every road, every rail. The success of the invasion would depend not just on the troops hitting the sand, but on the chaos the French could unleash from within. Harris handed Georges a map. 1 road, One checkpoint, a fuel depot outside Bayeux, lightly guarded but strategically critical. If it was destroyed before the invasion, it would cripple the German ability to move armor to the coast. Georges understood immediately. It was suicide. But the Chimera wasn't meant to last. It was meant to strike. He nodded, said nothing, and walked back to the barn. There was one weld still incomplete, one plate still loose. The road to Bayeux was soaked in fear. Every mile held ghosts, burnt-out convoys, shattered farmhouses, trees splintered by artillery. Georges Lecointe had driven this road many times before, delivering grain, fixing engines, towing broken carts. But now he drove it inside a steel box of his own making, sweating behind a welded plate of iron, hands shaking on the improvised controls. The Chimera was louder than expected, its mismatched engine parts howling in pain, metal treads groaning like they might split apart at any moment. But it moved, and for the first time in years, so did Georges, forward, not backward, toward fire, not away. Inside with him were two men. Andre, a young farmhand barely old enough to shave, now manning the machine gun, and Jules, a former machinist turned resistance courier, silent and stoic, cradling a satchel of explosives like a sleeping child. They were not trained, they were not hidden, but they were willing, and sometimes that's all war allows. The target was a fuel depot just outside Bayeux, more than a stockpile of gasoline. It was a logistical artery feeding German troop movements across the northern coast. The depot was protected by a small garrison of Wehrmacht soldiers and a single armored half-track, but positioned near a bridge. If they could strike fast, destroy the depot, and disable the crossing, it would delay any reinforcements heading toward the beaches when the Allied landings began. That was the plan, but plans in war are dreams on paper. Georges had no illusions. This was a one-way road. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of the depot. The Chimera, cloaked in dust and silence, rolled into a field beneath the cover of tall grass. From a nearby rise, Georges surveyed the target. A fuel convoy had just arrived. 3 tankers, soldiers unloading, laughing, smoking. Their guard was down. Georges knew the window would not last. He turned to Andre and Jules, their faces drawn tight with fear. No words were needed. They had trained for nothing and prepared for everything. The plan was simple: charge in, draw fire, sow chaos, and let Jules plant the charges. Then run, or try to. The Chimera roared to life, shaking the ground beneath them. It broke through the hedgerow like a beast unchained. Soldiers froze, caught mid-laugh, their cigarettes falling from their mouths as the iron monster screamed toward them. For a second, no one fired. They thought it was a Panzer. Then they saw the shape, the crude plating, the mismatched turret, the grinding noise like a tortured machine, and they understood. This was not German. This was madness, made real. The first burst from the MG-34 tore through a fuel drum, erupting into a column of flame. Screams filled the night. Andre gritted his teeth, spraying bullets in short, controlled bursts as Georges steered through the chaos. The Chimera took hits. Bullets ricocheted off the armor like hail on a church bell. One punched through a viewing slit, slicing Georges' cheek. Another dented the gun shield, nearly knocking Andre back. But the Chimera kept going. It plowed into a sandbag wall, knocking over crates and scattering men like leaves. Then Jules leapt from the back hatch, face ghost white, eyes locked on the depot's main storehouse. He ran like a man on fire. Dodging tracer rounds, he threw himself against the outer wall, pulling the satchel from his chest. Georges couldn't see him anymore, but he felt it, every second ticking louder than the engine. A blast rocked the earth. The fuel tanks ignited, spewing fire across the compound. The sky turned orange, smoke curling into the stars. Screams cut through the roar of the blaze. The half-track opened fire, its mounted gun lighting up the Chimera's flank. Sparks flew. The right tread cracked. Georges screamed through gritted teeth, pulling hard on the controls, forcing the Chimera into a wide, broken turn to shield Jules' escape route. Jules didn't return. The explosion had thrown him back. Georges saw it in a flash. His body crumpled near the blast zone, unmoving. There was no time. Soldiers regrouped, panicked but angry now. The Chimera's armor was buckling. André shouted that they had to run, but Georges stayed. He knew the engine wouldn't last another minute. He told André to go, crawl through the rear hatch, and run. The boy hesitated, then nodded. He disappeared into the smoke. Georges took one last breath of the scorched air. The controls in his hands were shaking, not from damage but from his own failing strength. He thought of his daughter, her small hands holding a toy tractor. Her question, "Papa, why do you fix things that are already broken?" "Because some things are worth saving." He rammed the Chimera forward, straight into the half-track. Sparks screamed as metal met metal. The two machines collided in a scream of steel. Georges grabbed the last charge from beneath his seat, a homemade explosive packed with nails and shrapnel. He lit the fuse. The flames burned for 2 days. Smoke rose over Bayeux like a funeral pyre, thick and oily, curling into the June sky as Allied bombers screamed overhead. By the time American boots stormed Omaha Beach just miles away, the road from the east was still choked with rubble and ruin. The fuel depot was gone. The bridge collapsed. Communications severed. What should have been a coordinated German counterattack was now a tangled, desperate response. In the grand machinery of D-Day, it was one disruption among hundreds. Small, brutal, almost forgettable. But in the chaos of war, that single fracture in the German line bought time. Minutes became hours. Hours became footholds. And footholds turned into liberation. No one officially recorded the Chimera. No reports were filed. No medal was awarded. No name engraved in the halls of military glory. The resistance didn't work like that. Its victories were buried beneath rubble, hidden in whispers, passed like ghost stories through taverns and trenches. But in Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, people remembered. They remembered the night the barn exploded in smoke and iron. They remembered the roaring beast of steel rising from the fields. They remembered the wild engineer, Georges Lecointe, who vanished into the fire. André survived, wounded, burned, deaf in one ear. He made it to the woods, helped by locals, smuggled through resistance lines. When American forces reached Bayeux, they found him half-starved but alive. He told them everything. At first, the officers didn't believe it. A homemade tank, built from a tractor? It sounded like myth. But when they followed him back to the wreckage site, all doubts vanished. Twisted steel, blackened plating, remnants of makeshift armor, a crushed half-track still smoking. One American engineer reportedly knelt beside the wreck and whispered, "Who the hell was this guy?" The remains of Georges Lecointe were never found. Some believed he died in the final blast, torn apart in the collision. Others claimed he escaped in the chaos, vanishing into the forest like a ghost. A few in the village even whispered that he was seen days later, limping through wheat fields at dawn, face covered in soot, eyes burning with something that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite peace. The truth remains buried, alongside so many others who gave everything without asking for credit. But in that barn, in those fields, and in that final act of impossible defiance, Georges had done what most generals only dreamed of. He had changed the course of a battle with nothing but scrap, sweat, and the sheer force of will. As the Allies surged forward, reclaiming village after village, the story of the Chimera followed them. Resistance fighters began building their own armored vehicles, inspired by the legend. Most failed. Some worked. But none carried the same weight as that first beast. Born not in a factory, but in a farmer's soul, a team of British intelligence officers later compiled reports from across the region. In one, an officer wrote, "The presence of improvised resistance armor at Bayeux delayed Axis armor response to Sector Omaha by an estimated 6 hours. Cause unknown mechanized unit designated Chimera. Recommend further inquiry." That inquiry never came. Bureaucracy moved on, but war remembers its ghosts. In the years after the liberations of France, as the rubble was cleared and new governments rose from the ashes, the story of Georges Lecointe faded into obscurity. He had no surviving records, no military papers, no official mention in the sprawling narratives of the Second World War. His name didn't appear in textbooks. He wasn't studied in war colleges. But in Saint-Laurent, a small iron plaque still hangs above a doorway, not polished, not grand, just quiet and firm. It reads, À celui qui fit du fer un cri de liberté, to the one who turned iron into a cry for freedom. And every year on June 6th, villagers gather there. No speeches, no parades, just silence, respect, and a long moment staring into the field where a barn once stood and where history once rolled forward on clanking treads and burning wheels. The Chimera never made it to a museum. Its remains were too broken, too scattered. A few pieces, sections of armor, part of a tread, were collected by local resistance museums. One engineer decades later called it a miracle of wartime improvisation. But Georges hadn't built it to be admired. He built it because no one else would. He built it because he couldn't accept surrender, because the land he'd grown up on, the machines he'd loved, the future he wanted for his daughter, were all slipping away. And when you can't stop a storm, sometimes the only thing left is to become lightning. He wasn't a war hero in the traditional sense. He didn't lead troops or plan operations. He had no medals, no uniform, no command. But in that moment, on that road, under that sky, Georges Lecointe stood between tyranny and freedom. Not because he was ordered to. Years passed. The war ended, but the silence it left behind was deafening. Cities celebrated liberation, flags were raised, speeches delivered. But in the small village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, victory felt quieter, carved in scars, in fields still littered with steel, and in homes with empty chairs. The name Georges Lecointe was rarely spoken aloud. It wasn't out of shame or secrecy, but reverence. He had become something between myth and memory, too big for ordinary words, too sacred for casual mention. In the years after the war, the story of the Chimera flickered like a candle in a drafty room. Sometimes strong, sometimes nearly extinguished, but never forgotten entirely. And the one person who carried it closest, deepest, was his daughter, Eloise. She had been just 5 when he vanished, too young to understand war, too old to forget him. Her earliest memories were not of fairy tales or lullabies, but of the sharp scent of fuel, the hiss of the welding torch in the barn, and the quiet strength of her father's hands, scarred, stained, always busy. After the night he didn't return, the village elders had told her mother, he died a hero. But Eloise didn't want a hero. She wanted him. She waited on the steps of their home for weeks after the explosion, staring at the horizon like he might walk out of the smoke, holding his toolbox, smiling that lopsided smile. He never came. Her mother never remarried, never left the village. The war had taken too much, and peace didn't bring healing. It brought quiet and guilt and grief. But Eloise grew. As a teenager, she began asking questions, first to her neighbors, then to resistance veterans who passed through town. Bits of the story returned, fragments of what her father had built, what he had done. An American Georges once sent her a torn page from a field report that mentioned a makeshift tank near Bayeux. A British officer mailed her a shell casing engraved with the words La Chimère, June 5, 1944. She kept them all in a wooden box beneath her bed, building her own archive of a man history had overlooked. But the world moved on. By the 1960s, the miracle of D-Day had become textbook material. Politicians talked of strategy, of Eisenhower's brilliance, of Rommel's failure. There were parades, movies, documentaries. No one mentioned a farmer's tank. No one spoke of a ghost machine roaring through fire before the first Allied boat hit the beach. Eloise watched these stories unfold with a quiet ache in her chest. Not because she needed fame, but because truth mattered. Because there had been thunder before the storm, and her father was that thunder. So she wrote it down, page after page, year after year. She documented every scrap of memory, every whispered tale, every photograph, sketch, and artifact she could recover. Her writing was not dramatic, not polished, but it was precise and filled with love. She contacted museums, military historians, resistance archives. Most responded with polite curiosity, but few took her seriously. One historian told her kindly, "There's no record of a French-built tank in the Normandy campaign. Perhaps your father helped the Maquis in other ways." She smiled, thanked him, and continued anyway. In 1984, 40 years after the Chimera's charge, she published the story herself. The Engineers' War. It was printed by a local press, barely distributed, barely read, but it found its way into the right hands. A French war veteran who had served with the FF Warren near Bayeux read it, then wrote her a letter. I remember the explosion, he said. We were told it was a bombing run. But the wreckage we found, it wasn't from the Skauertbahn. It was like something crawled up from the earth and fought the Germans head on. The letter was validation. Others followed. Slowly, a small chorus grew. Engineers marveled at the Chimère's ingenuity. Resistance fighters confirmed Georges' involvement. The story gained traction, not in headlines but in hearts. A decade later, a museum in Normandy created a small exhibit, Improvised Armor of the Resistance. At its center sat a twisted piece of metal, part of a fender, blackened with soot, engraved by Eloise herself, property of the Chimère. She was in her 60s by then, with children of her own, and still she stood in front of that relic like a little girl waiting for her father to come home. One day, a French filmmaker visited her home, requesting an interview. He wanted to make a documentary about resistance inventions. He asked her, "Why did your father do it? Why risk everything for one machine that couldn't even survive the night?" Eloise didn't hesitate. "Because courage," she said, "is not measured by what lasts. It's measured by what changes." That line would echo in the film's final scene. Audiences across France wept. Veterans stood in silence.